In a time where people are hungry for more binge-worthy TV dramas, the sport of tennis has provided in spades, offering a legal drama that not even a Netflix TV crew could script. World number one tennis player Novak Djokovic was deported from Australia on the opening day of the first Grand Slam, the Australian Open. And while the tennis tournament rolls on, questions around immigration laws, proper governance, international relations, the role of celebrity and the long-term effects of COVID-19 crisis rumble away in its wake. Today on Michelson Alexander Explains, we will explore the Novax Saga in 3 parts. First, we will explore the process that led to Djokovic's deportation. Then we'll analyse from a strategic communications viewpoint the performance of each of the major stakeholders, and finally assess the fallout from such a major international political event. Alongside me is Senior Associate James Fitzpatrick. Welcome.
Thanks, Sabrina. Nice to be here.
And our special guest today is Michelson Alexander Special Advisor Dr Abul Rizvi. Abul is the former Deputy Secretary in Department of Immigration and of the Department of Communications. During his career, Abul was awarded the Public Service Medal and the Centenary Medal of Services to the development and implementation of Australian immigration policy. And if that wasn't enough, he recently completed a PhD on immigration via the University of Melbourne. Before we get to the analysis, perhaps it's best practice to refresh ourselves on the sequence of events.
I'm not gonna give you an answer tonight. I know what you want to ask me, but you will be informed. That's it. That's all I can tell you. I cannot give you any date, but obviously Australia is around the corner, so you will know very soon.
That exemption affords him the opportunity to come into Australia, come into Victoria and compete at the Australian Open. So he's currently on a flight on his way here and gets here sometime today.
So we await his presentation and what evidence he provides to support that. If that evidence is insufficient, then he won't be treated any different to anyone else and he'll be on the next plane home. So there should be no special rules for Novak Djokovic at all, none whatsoever.
The advice that I have literally just received before joining you is that the visa for Novak Djokovic has been cancelled.
As a mother, what can I say? If you are a mother, you can just imagine how can I feel. I feel terrible since yesterday, last 24 hours, that they are keeping him as a prisoner.
Djokovic is not being held captive in Australia. He is free to leave at any time that he chooses to do so, and Border Force will actually facilitate.
Novak was making so many stupid mistakes with that COVID isolation, going in Spain, and before that having out of isolation before 15 days, during that signing some stupid things with those journalists, whatever.
Good evening. Just moments ago, the Immigration Minister has cancelled Novak Djokovic's visa. Paul Caddick has been following the developments tonight. Paul, what more can you tell us?
Good evening, Angela. Yes, indeed, just in the last few minutes, that official statement has come out from Immigration Minister Alex Hawke, a decision some 4 days in the making. I have it here, let me read it to you. Today, I exercise my power under Section 133C3 of the Migration Act to cancel the visa held by Mr Novak Djokovic on health and good order grounds, on the basis that it was in the public interest to do so.
The orders of the court are: 1, the amended application be dismissed with costs.
All right, well, let's jump straight in then to the process around this Novak Djokovic issue. This is one of the rare occurrences where border control due process has been put under the microscope in the public sphere. So, Abul, in your opinion, was Djokovic's visa process standard practice or something unusual?
It wasn't standard practice in terms of how we did these sorts of things prior to COVID. It appears to have become standard practice after COVID. Fundamentally, our border management system operates at three levels. There's a first layer, which is the visa. The second layer is where you board the plane. And the third layer is where you go through the primary line at the airport. Essentially, good design of visa systems is you do as much of the checking as you possibly can at the first layer and you minimise checking at the third layer. And that's because there is limited scope within our airports to manage huge numbers of passengers. So essentially we allocate about 30 to 40 seconds per passenger at the primary line. If it takes you more than 40 seconds, the system starts to groan and airports become choked. But under COVID, we have shifted a lot of the crucial decision-making to the airport. Now that's okay because movements were down to less than 1% of what is standard. But what happens when we move above 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15%? Airports become choked. The current system can't cope.
Issue then with Djokovic come about because they've moved the system to the airport. Is that the source of where this mess has come from?
Yes. Well, leaving aside Mr. Djokovic's own decision not to get vaccinated, which is the true origin of the problem, but let's put that to one side. Yes, we have for as long as I can remember, and probably much longer, operated what's known as a controversial visitor system, where anyone who is regarded as potentially controversial for whatever reason is put on what is known as the movement alert list. So when they apply for a visa, it doesn't go through the standard process of a junior officer looking at it and just applying the standard considerations. It gets transmitted to Canberra and it is managed out of Canberra by senior officials. It seems no one in the government, either at the bureaucratic level or at the ministerial level, thought Mr. Djokovic's case would be sufficiently controversial to put him on the movement alert list. And as a result, his visa application was processed as if it was common or garden.
Is that just an oversight of someone who just doesn't watch tennis? Or is that... How could be a tennis possibly happen? Because Novak Djokovic, tennis aside, he is still one of the most renowned sports stars of the world. Even someone who isn't a fan of tennis, well, how does someone working within the government not know something outside their own government?
I get the impression this was not on the government's radar in any significant way until the 4th of January, when the Australian population got white-hot angry about Mr. Djokovic's social media post.
So obviously you've highlighted a few issues there of why this mess might have started in the first case, in putting so much strain and power to border force at that last step. But as Sabrina alluded there was a lot of public backlash, particularly with Djokovic's stance on anti-vaccination and other elements. It then seemed like there was government involvement in the process at certain times, or political involvement in the process at different times. Is that commonplace?
Oh, ministers becoming involved when a case becomes controversial is not unusual at all. So there have been lots and lots of immigration cases going back to the 40s and 50s where ministers were suddenly dragged in and because there was public interest in the case. So that's not unusual. The unusual thing here was that I think it was the morning or around lunchtime on the 5th of January when the Prime Minister was asked about the case. And he said, oh, look, Mr. Djokovic has a medical exemption from the Victorian government. We accept the medical exemption provided by the Victorian government. If you've got any questions to ask on this matter, ask the Victorian government. So that was standard practice response. Sometime in the afternoon of the 5th of January, Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews issues a press release that says, no, we don't accept medical exemptions provided by state government at face value. We will look behind those exemptions. As far as I'm aware, that is the first time that any government minister at the Commonwealth level articulated a policy of looking behind medical exemptions provided by a state government. And when the Prime Minister the next day says rules are rules, what he didn't say was, and we just changed them.
Can I just shift gears here? And so let's talk about the other stakeholder in this, which is Tennis Australia. So James, if you were asked and tasked with advising Tennis Australia in the lead up to this situation, how would you do so?
It seems as though they were blindsided by what the government did and how they got involved in the process. But I don't think that was unpredictable. Like, as Abul said, it's common for them to get involved. We've got elections coming up this year. We've had anti-vaccination and pro-vaccination debate going on for a long time now. And we knew coming up to the Australian Open that Novak, who has been at the centre of a lot of that debate in the global sporting sphere, was always going to be an issue. And I think the government getting involved to the extent that they did and blocking him and probably winning a few political points along the way ahead of the next election, because they can then reiterate what they've claimed for many years. And Abul, I know you'll have some thoughts on this as well, but they've claimed for many years that they're really strong on borders. Something that the Liberal National Government has gone back to over and over again in the lead up to elections and part of election campaigns. They're strong on borders, and this was an easy win for them to show just how strong they are. So I think if you were at Tennis Australia several months ago thinking about, okay, what are we going to do in the lead up to this Australian Open? I think you could probably predict that the federal government was going to get involved at some stage. Therefore, I think they probably needed to prepare a little bit better for that. It's always going to be difficult, and I know they were going to do whatever they could to get one of their number one ticket sellers into Melbourne Park. But maybe they needed to take that hard choice early days and avoid this mess and avoid what has now damaged their reputation and damaged their operations right up to day one of Melbourne Park. They were sort of embroiled in this saga. Maybe they needed to cut their losses early and say, as a group, look, but there's a high probability that Novak's not going to get it in, and that the federal government is going to step in and block what we've got planned. So let's cut our losses now and take a pretty hard-line stance and not fight for him. And maybe we would have avoided this saga all along.
I think it's fair to say what Tennis Australia did was try to push every area of government to give them a yes on Djokovic. When they got the letter from Hunt, which effectively said no, they would have been caught in a difficult bind. On the one hand, the government's given Djokovic already a visa. So 11 days before Mr. Hunt's letter, the Australian government gave Djokovic a visa. So they would have been in the difficult position of saying, well, it seems one part of government has decided to let him in and another part of government is telling us no. And I think against that background, they kept pushing. And they eventually found a way through the system to get Djokovic in, because they wanted him in for all the reasons that you've described. They couldn't, perhaps they should, but perhaps it was difficult to anticipate the size of the backlash and the way the government reacted to the backlash. That was probably difficult. I suspect when they got Djokovic in, they would have thought victory.
I think the one in analysing Tennis Australia's approach to this from the communications point of view, I think the other thing that stood out to me, which I quite liked, is as it did all crumble down for them, and perhaps they were willing to take on that risk of that happening, and maybe the reward was going to outweigh the risk, and they probably had some mitigation in there. What I did like was once the dust had settled a little bit, the board came out and backed in the CEO, and I think that's what I like to see. Is if you are going to take the risk, if you are going to go out strong and campaign for Djokovic to get in and try and do what you can to make that happen, then as an organisation, it's nice to see the board and the other stakeholders back that in, even if it crumbles and even if it fails. And I think that from a communications point of view, I think that's a pretty solid approach in the circumstance.
Yeah. I think Tennis Australia and probably the Victorian government were caught between a rock and a hard place on this. On the one hand, the people who manage the borders said, you've got a visa, you can come in. Let's assume then he does come in and Tennis Australia and the Victorian government say, well, you haven't got an exemption to play in the Aussie Open. You know, go and visit Melbourne Zoo and have a good time, mate. That was not sustainable either.
And I think that probably leads to a discussion that we've looked at a little bit in our podcast series before around how organisations should be presenting themselves in the COVID debate. Should organisations be advocating for vaccinations, or should they get involved in the anti-vax debate? I think in this specific question or this specific circumstance, Sabrine, I'd put to you as a tennis organisation, as Tennis Australia, are there any risks or issues with them from a communications point of view, advocating for an anti-vaxxer and unvaccinated superstar like they have in this circumstance with Djokovic.
In my personal opinion, I think there is a very fine line that you are treading for advocating for anti-vax. In Australia, our rules are that, well, particularly the Australian Open, the rules were that if you're unvaccinated, you can't play. Those were the rules for everybody. It wasn't just a rule for Novak Djokovic. And so if you set a precedent like that, then you have to follow it. You can't just set a rule and just flip-flop based on who the player is, no matter how much money he brings and the supporter base he has in Australia, all around the world. They gave him a bit of a leeway because I know that there were a lot of different tennis players that arrived on the Australian border or Australian shores and they were turned away. They were given the option to turn away, and they did turn away. And I think,
Sabrine, they were turned away after the rules changed.
On
the 6th of January. Prior to the 6th of January, the rules were different and they got in.
Yeah.
And they, from a medical perspective, not a superstardom perspective, they were in the identical position as Mr. Djokovic. They hadn't been vaccinated and they had an exemption based on having had COVID in the last 6 months. So they were treated differently until the matter exploded and the rules and processes changed.
If we look now instead to the federal government and analysing their response and what this means for their reputation and perhaps what will happen in the future, Abul, I'd be keen to know, the first appeal proved that Mr. Djokovic's visa was cancelled a little too hastily, perhaps. But does this confirm the federal government's hardline stance on immigration laws?
Well, a couple of things there. The first is that the initial cancellation was, in substance, leaving aside the procedural issues, in substance was about the fact that Mr. Djokovic represented a public health risk because he was unvaccinated, could potentially catch COVID and spread it to lots of tennis players and spectators, etc. We know the second decision explicitly said Mr. Djokovic is a very low risk from a COVID perspective. And who does that view come from? It comes from the Commonwealth Chief Medical Officer, no less. So the first decision, the government is saying, was actually not well-founded in substance because he didn't represent this huge risk. He may have represented a political risk and a generating public anger risk, but he didn't represent a COVID risk. The second decision was made on a completely new basis. Someone between those two decisions made this up, which is that Mr. Djokovic would stoke anti-vaccination sentiment in Australia because he's a prominent anti-vaxxer. Now, that is completely new policy. We have never before refused anyone a visa or kicked them out of the country on that basis. Mr. Djokovic was the first. So Mr. Djokovic was the first to get his visa cancelled because we overturned a medical exemption, and Mr. Djokovic was the first to have a visa cancelled because he's an anti-vaxxer. Two rule changes, which were pretty dramatic.
And do you think we'll see more of that in the future then?
Well, Kelly Slater apparently is keen to participate at Bells Beach, one of the world's biggest surfing tournaments, and he is apparently a prominent anti-vaxxer. Sports Minister Richard Colbeck has said there's no way he's coming to Australia. My question to Mr. Colbeck would be, does that mean you'll run the same process as Mr. Djokovic on this? That is, you'll give him a visa, he'll arrive at Melbourne Airport, and then you'll kick him out? Is that the plan? Or have you worked out that it's actually a better idea not to give him a visa in the first place? By putting him on the movement alert list, the alert comes through and someone senior in Canberra manages the process to make sure it's legal and strongly based. I suspect that's the way they'll go, which is the way they should have gone with Djokovic in the first place. But the pressure's on the new federal government now to put in place processes and systems that are really designed very differently to the way we've operated for the last 18 months. And I am not confident the government has spent the money early enough to make changes to the system. I think the earliest they will make changes to the system will be the 1st of July 2022. And in the meantime, we will have a dramatic increase in arrivals at the airport, well above the 1% we've had in recent months, where at the primary line, the airport officer has to ask you the question, show me your vaccination status, and people from different parts of the world will show all sorts of different things. Some will be on their phone, some will be a piece of paper, some will be written in a language the airport officer doesn't understand, and they'll have to make those decisions very quickly whilst you stand there as a passenger waiting for them to let you through. Once the numbers increase, you can't have the airport officer thinking, oh, God, I wonder what that language that's in. That doesn't work.
So we could be seeing a whole lot of issues over the next couple of months until they clean that system or that process up.
Well, I think two problems will arise. One, people will turn up and will be let through quickly because the airport processing officer is under so much pressure because there's just this huge crowd standing behind them, tapping their fingers, come on, mate, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Or the airports will just become gridlocked because you can't process those things in 30 to 40 seconds. It's going to take you a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever.
James, do you think such an event like Djokovic deporting a celebrity like Djokovic was an easy win, political win, for the federal government?
In short, yes. I think it's a reasonably high risk approach, given that a lot of people will also disagree with the decision. But as we discussed at the start of this episode, their approach and what they ended up doing and some of the captain calls they might have made along the way in the process, their involvement with it aligns to the Liberal national stance or their one-liners for the past couple of decades about being strong on borders. And this was, even if not completely true from a policy sense, this was a really easy way to show to potential voters how strong they are on borders. There was someone that they didn't want in the country and they were able to intervene and ensure that they didn't come in. And again, I think this is why Tennis Australia or other sports organisations should probably have been able to predict that behaviour, particularly as we head into another election. Though that brings me then to the question of the Victorian government. So putting the federal government to one side, there's so many different stakeholders in this saga, which makes it oh so juicy. But the Victorian government have been awfully quiet throughout the process, apart from when they were directly asked. Do you think, Abul, that was the right move for them, for the Victorian government, to stay out of it as much as possible?
The point at which they had a choice was that medical exemption process that they designed in conjunction with Tennis Australia. Now, designing that process in the way they did, assuming they were aware of Greg Hunt's letter to Tennis Australia, and I don't know whether they were or weren't, left open the possibility that Djokovic would get a medical exemption. Now, whether that was a conscious political decision to allow that to be designed that way, or whether that was just public servants thinking, oh, here's a clever way of doing it, that'll wash our hands of the problem, I don't know. But I think managing such a high-profile case like this through an anonymous process was too clever by half.
And why do you say that?
If you're going to manage a case like Djokovic, you process it in terms of good administrative practice, knowing who you are processing. And you make a decision based on the facts so that you can defend the decision publicly because you have the facts there. Doing it through an arm's length committee that doesn't know whether it's Djokovic they're processing or not leaves you open to risks that I think could have been reduced if the Victorian government was more open about it. But I get the impression the Victorian government really didn't want to make a call on Djokovic. They wanted the Commonwealth to make the call. And that's probably why they agreed to this rather odd process.
That's a really interesting point and not one I've thought of before, because when you first hear of anything where it's a blind a blind audition or a blind review, you don't know who the applicant is. Normally, people would argue that that's always going to be the fairest way to do things. But in this circumstance, I understand, Abul, that here you've actually got a scenario where the applicant has, because of who they are, they have other considerations that should influence your decision for the benefit of the country. In this case, that's the
good administrative decision-making involves you engaging with the applicant, asking them questions, testing the evidence they provide, and then making a sensible decision. The blind process meant they couldn't ask any questions. They had to just work off the paperwork they got given. That's always a very limited decision.
So we've looked at the federal government, we've looked at Tennis Australia, we've looked at the Victorian government. The last key player then is the actual player himself, Novak Djokovic. And Sabrina, I'll put this question to you. For Novak Djokovic, people like Novak, do prominent sports celebrities have a duty to perform for the public good in scenarios like this?
Novak Djokovic, like most sports stars, or even just celebrities, they're role models. They're role models not only for the public, but just for the younger generation. Think about the sport that he plays in, tennis. He's not part of a team. He is the superstar himself. So when he wins, it's not the team that wins, it's him. He is the face of Serbian tennis. He is the face of world tennis because he's the number one. And he needs to be aware of the decisions that he makes, because it'll then influence the younger generation. I remember when I was playing tennis, when I was a young kid, I loved Novak Djokovic, and I still do. I still think that he's a great tennis player on court. Off court, he does a lot of things, advocating for fair distribution of pay for those not highly ranked in tennis. And I just think that, to have that such persuasion and pull amongst the younger generation, I think you do have a duty to play for the public good. Just because I remember I bought Novak Djokovic's book when I was younger. He said he was going gluten-free, and that's what changed his diet and made him number one. So what did I do? I went gluten-free for 2 weeks because I thought that I'd be the number one tennis player after that. So, in this situation, if Novak Djokovic chooses not to get vaccinated, that's fine. But the rule was, he needed to either be vaccinated to play or show an exemption. It didn't work out his way. He had to go home. And so at the end of the day, what does that do for the younger generation? My opinion is that they'll probably remember at some point that, that Novak wasn't here to play the Australian Open, and that's what affects him the most, that he can't inspire that younger generation at the Australian Open this year. There's a lot of kids lining up to go see him. There's a lot of people going to see him, and they're so disappointed that they can't see him. I'm disappointed that I can't see him. So as Rafael Nadal said, his actions had consequences. And it's unfortunate that it played out this way, but, there's a long year to go ahead, and maybe he'll change his mind, maybe not. But, these are things that will inform other governments around the world, the French government, the British government, US government, on how they're going to deal with the situation and how they're going to deal with players like Novak Djokovic.
Absolutely, they do have a responsibility, increasingly so now. But even if you think back to the 30s and 40s with people like Babe Ruth and Don Bradman, they were similarly role models. What Don Bradman did, kids in Australia copied. So this is not new that famous sports people are role models. Absolutely, whether they like it or not, and they much of their income is earned because of their role model status. So they've got an obligation. And you're right about other countries. Other countries will be looking at this, I am sure, and trying to work out, well, how are we going to manage this in the future? Not just the sports star element, but the broader question of how are we going to manage the movement of unvaccinated people?
The last element that I wanted to throw into this discussion is the fact that we're seeing Djokovic spent time in detention after his visa was cancelled. It highlighted some of the conditions and situation other long-term detainees face in Australia daily, albeit his in a slightly different circumstance. There were certain groups and others that use this as an opportunity to highlight those circumstances and highlight some of the issues Australia faces with offshore detention and detaining people who have sought asylum in Australia. So a question to you then, Abul, is that because this had such global focus on it, global media attention, and a celebrity who was then put under those detention requirements and circumstances, do you think this will shine a light on the Australian government's detention program, and will this change the circumstances of how the program is run into the future?
I think it's certainly shone a light on it, which is a good thing. Will the government change its policy before the election? I don't think there's a hope of that. Will not happen. They are locked into that policy and they believe it's a vote winner. Whether it is or not, I've got no idea, but they believe it. I think the important thing here from a policy perspective is to distinguish how offshore boat arrivals have been handled long-term this time around compared to the first time we did this. The first time we did this, of course, was triggered by another event, Tampa. We introduced offshore detention and we also then subsequently introduced boat turnbacks. The offshore detention significantly slowed boat arrivals, turnbacks stopped them. So after Tampa, we had hardly any boats once turnbacks were in place. We put the people on Manus and Nauru, but within 2 years, almost all of them had been resettled predominantly in Australia. Now, you might say 2 years is a long time, but compared to 10 years, it's quite quick. In this instance, we've said, you shall never be settled in Australia. And even if we have granted you refugee status, you will remain in detention if you came by boat and were transferred from Manus and Nauru to Australia. From a policy perspective, that is just a nonsense approach. It's just throwing taxpayers' money at keeping people in cruelty for no policy benefit whatsoever. Whether there are votes in it, well, who knows?
So votes aside, though, if you were an organisation involved in this debate and trying to campaign for the change in conditions for detention centres and the like, would you be recommending that they use the Novak event as a way to get more influence or change over time?
I don't think the Novak event would influence Mr. Morrison. I think what would influence Mr. Morrison is to put the question to him, why were Howard and Ruddock able to resettle these people in Australia within 2 years without the boats restarting, and you cannot? Is it a matter of competence or is it a matter of politics?
We've covered a lot of ground this afternoon. Abul, was there anything else that you would like to add into the mix that we haven't discussed yet?
One thing I would like to throw into the mix is this view that the current government has been good on borders. On every objective piece of evidence that you would consider, including the dozen or so indicators I used to use to measure the health of the visa system that I looked after for about a decade, this government has been a disaster on borders. We have more people on bridging visas than we've had ever in our history. There are 333,000 people currently on bridging visas living in Australia. I remember previous ministers used to get angry at me when the numbers got much above 20,000. We have 95,000 asylum seekers living in the community, the vast bulk of whom, 99-point-something% of them, arrived in the last 4 to 5 years. They are living in the community. They are in highly vulnerable circumstances, predominantly working on farms, exploited to an extreme level, and yet we sweep the issue under the carpet. Processing times have blown out for every visa category to an enormous degree. The system is in very poor health.
That's very interesting insight, Abul, and it really digs down below the high-level surface that most of us get on a daily basis. So I really appreciate your thought and analysis there, and getting to the bottom of what's happened in this circumstance and what it means for the future as well, in what is obviously a highly politicised area. And when you throw in the mix global celebrities, sports stars, and one of Australia's favourite events on the sporting calendar, it's only going to get more spicy.
Thank you for tuning in, everybody. And we will be dropping a couple of episodes in the near future. So make sure you are subscribed to the show on your favourite podcasting platform. And we will see you soon.